But I go, can I just try another one? That moment comes and I just go, this is Sparta!
Picture this. A man screaming into a canyon of blue screens, sweat pouring down a body that has been pushed past its breaking point, and somewhere off camera, a crew member rushing another injured actor to a waiting ambulance. This wasn't a horror film set. This was 300, the movie that turned a low-budget history epic into one of the most quoted films of the century. And according to Gerard Butler himself, what audiences saw on screen was only a fraction of what really happened while the cameras were rolling. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why Butler has called this the most physically destructive role of his entire career. When 300 landed in theaters in March of 2007, nobody in Hollywood expected much from it. There were no A-list movie stars carrying the marquee, no sweeping historical drama in the traditional sense, and no guarantee that audiences would connect with a film built almost entirely out of computer-generated backdrops. Director Zack Snyder had adapted Frank Miller's graphic novel with an almost obsessive devotion to the source material, chasing a visual style nobody had really attempted before at this scale. It was a gamble. Studios don't like gambles. And yet, within days of release, it became clear that 300 was not going to be just another action movie. It exploded at the box office, pulling in tens of millions of dollars in its opening weekend alone against a production budget that, by blockbuster standards, was fairly modest. By the time its theatrical run wrapped up, the film had earned several times its budget worldwide, a number that stunned executives who had been lukewarm on the project just months earlier. But the money was only part of the story. What really cemented 300 in pop culture wasn't the box office chart. It was the way it reshaped how people thought about the male physique on screen. Almost overnight, Gerard Butler's Spartan King Leonidas became the new benchmark for cinematic strength. Gyms began offering Spartan-themed classes. Fitness magazines ran cover stories asking how ordinary men could get the 300 body. Personal trainers built entire client rosters around recreating what audiences had seen in the film. It wasn't just a movie anymore. It had become a fitness movement, a cultural shorthand for extreme physical transformation. And for years, most people assumed the story ended there, that some actors worked out hard, put on a costume, and delivered a few iconic lines. It took a long time for Gerard Butler to actually explain what that transformation cost him and everyone else on that set. Here's the part that fans rarely hear about. Behind the roaring battle cries and the slow-motion swordplay was a production environment that, by Butler's own account, bordered on chaotic. In interviews given years after the film's release, Butler has described a set where injuries weren't rare accidents. They were a near-daily occurrence. He has recalled watching fellow performers get hurt in the middle of choreographed fight sequences, from awkward falls that resulted in broken bones to close calls involving the blunted but still solid weapons used in combat scenes. He's described turning around mid-take to see a crew member rushing someone off set toward medical attention, only for filming to resume shortly after, as if nothing had happened. It became such a routine part of the production that, according to Butler, almost everyone on set eventually accepted that pain and physical risk were simply part of the job description. Part of the reason for this constant stream of injuries traces back to a very deliberate choice Zack Snyder made early in production. Rather than leaning heavily on stunt doubles for the film's elaborate battle choreography, the director wanted his actors performing as much of the physical action themselves as possible. The goal was authenticity, capturing real bodies moving with real weight and real momentum, something that's much harder to fake convincingly with a double standing in. It gave the film its visceral, almost tactile quality, the sense that you were watching actual combat rather than a carefully staged sequence. But it also meant that the cast, most of whom were not trained stunt performers, were repeatedly throwing themselves into high-impact sequences, take after take, in tight quarters, surrounded by blue screens, wearing heavy armor and wielding real props. Bruises and muscle strain became a normal part of the daily routine. Cuts were patched up between setups. There was no easing into the physical demands of the role. The intensity simply never let up. And that intensity actually began long before a single camera rolled. to transform himself into a convincing Spartan king. Gerard Butler entered one of the most punishing training regimens ever documented in modern Hollywood. For roughly 7 months leading up to filming, he trained under legendary strength coach Mark Twight at a facility known as Gym Jones, a name that has since become almost mythical among fitness enthusiasts. These weren't casual gym sessions. Some days stretched up to 6 hours, blending traditional strength training with brutal conditioning circuits, martial arts drills, and functional movement work designed to build not just visible muscle, but genuine combat-ready strength and stamina. Twight's approach was famously unforgiving. He wasn't interested in actors who simply looked strong for the camera. He wanted men who could move like warriors, who had actually built the kind of resilience that translates into believable, powerful screen presence. The training didn't stop once filming began, either. Between takes, cast members would continue working out on set, lifting weights or knocking out bodyweight circuits just to maintain the pumped, vascular look the film required for its stylized visuals. It created a punishing cycle. Grueling physical training during the day, demanding stunt work in front of the cameras, and then more training to keep the body camera ready for the next scene. Butler has openly admitted that this relentless schedule nearly broke him physically. He's spoken about developing tendinitis, dealing with significant hip pain, and tearing his rotator cuff during the process. Injuries serious enough that there were stretches where lifting his own arms became genuinely difficult. Despite that, he kept pushing through, driven by a sense that anything less than full physical commitment would show up on screen as inauthentic. What made Butler's approach to Leonidas so distinctive wasn't just the physical punishment he put himself through, though. It was also how deeply he leaned into the psychological and emotional side of the role. He's described using meditation as part of his daily preparation, trying to mentally step into the headspace of a king who knowingly led a small force of men toward almost certain death for the sake of something larger than himself. For Butler, embodying Leonidas wasn't simply about hitting his marks and delivering his lines with enough volume. He wanted to actually understand, on some emotional level, what it would feel like to carry that kind of responsibility and that kind of sacrifice. That internal work, paired with the external physical toll, is part of why so many people who worked alongside him have described his performance as feeling less like acting and more like genuine transformation. Then there's the environment itself, which came with its own set of brutal challenges that had nothing to do with sword fighting. Almost the entire film was shot inside a studio in Montreal, with the vast majority of what audiences eventually saw on screen created afterward through visual effects. That meant actors were performing complex, emotionally demanding sequences while surrounded by blue and green screens instead of the sweeping mythic landscapes the finished film would eventually depict. There were no dramatic cliffside backdrops to react to, no atmospheric lighting from a real Aegean sunset, just fabric-covered walls, and imagination doing a lot of heavy lifting. On top of that, the specialized lighting rigs needed to achieve the film's signature high contrast, almost painterly look generated an enormous amount of heat. Combine that with heavy armor, physically demanding choreography, and hours-long shooting days, and you get a set that was, by all accounts, punishingly hot and exhausting. Butler has revealed that at one point during filming, the combination of dehydration and sheer physical exhaustion caused him to actually pass out on set. That's not something that typically makes it into a behind-the-scenes featurette, but it's very much part of the real story of how this film got made. Even the film's now iconic dialogue came with its own unusual production quirks. Take the character of the Oracle, whose eerie, almost trance-like delivery became one of the film's more memorable smaller moments. According to those who've discussed the production afterward, a significant portion of her unsettling, fragmented dialogue wasn't scripted in a conventional sense. It was shaped and refined in the moment to enhance that dreamlike, unsettling quality the scene needed. It's a small example of a larger pattern throughout the production. Snyder was constantly prioritizing mood, tone, and visual impact over strict adherence to a traditional shooting process, and that meant actors often had to adapt on the fly in ways audiences would never guess just from watching the finished film. Despite all of this, And maybe partly because of it, something genuinely powerful formed among the cast during those grueling months. Butler has talked at length about the bond that developed between him and his fellow performers, including Leonidas, who played Queen Gorgo, along with David Wenham, Dominic West, and a then-rising Michael Fassbender. These weren't just actors who showed up, hit their marks, and went home. They trained together, suffered through the same brutal workouts together, and leaned on each other through the heat, the exhaustion, and the repetitive grind of shooting action sequences in a windowless studio for months on end. Butler has described feeling like the cast had, in some strange way, already been through a kind of war together long before they ever set foot in front of the cameras for the film's biggest battle sequences. That shared physical and emotional suffering translated directly into how believable their on-screen brotherhood felt. Audiences could sense that these weren't just actors reciting lines about loyalty and sacrifice. There was something real underneath it, forged through months of shared hardship. It's worth pausing here to talk about just how far-reaching the cultural ripple effects of this film turn out to be, because it genuinely extended well beyond the box office. The now famous workout regimen the cast trained with, often referred to simply as the 300 workout, took on a life of its own after the film's release. Involving high-rep circuits of pull-ups, deadlifts, push-ups, box jumps, and kettlebell movements performed with minimal rest, it became something of a badge of honor in gym culture, a brutal benchmark that very few people, even trained athletes, could actually complete in one sitting. Reportedly, even among the cast members who trained for months to prepare for the film, only one person was ever able to finish the full routine as designed. Gerard Butler has admitted that after production wrapped, he was so physically and mentally drained that he didn't step foot in a gym again for well over a year. Think about that for a second. A man who spent 7 months building one of the most talked-about physiques in movie history was so depleted afterward that he needed an extended break just to recover. That kind of admission matters, because it complicates the simplified version of this story that most people are familiar with. The popular narrative is usually just, actors train hard, got ripped, made a cool movie. The real story, according to Butler, is one of genuine physical sacrifice with lasting consequences, not just a few months of intense gym sessions followed by a return to normal life. It also sparked broader conversations at the time about body image expectations, particularly for men, since the film's stylized aesthetic set an almost unattainable physical standard that plenty of viewers tried and struggled to replicate without understanding the extreme and unsustainable methods used to achieve it on screen. Beyond the physical and cultural impact, 300 also left a distinct fingerprint on how movies looked and felt for years afterward. Its heavy use of desaturated color grading, dramatic slow-motion combat, and stylized violence influenced a wave of projects that followed, from other historical epics to prestige television that borrowed similar visual techniques to heighten scale and emotion. It helped establish Zack Snyder as a director with a genuinely distinctive visual signature, one that would go on to define his approach to major projects in the years that followed. And of course, there's the line that transcended the film entirely. Butler's thunderous delivery of "This is Sparta" became one of those rare pieces of movie dialogue that escaped the confines of the film itself, turning into a meme, a punchline, and a piece of shorthand pop culture reference that persists to this day, referenced by people who may have never actually seen a movie it came from. Academically, the film even sparked a renewed wave of interest in ancient history, particularly around the Battle of Thermopylae, the real historical event the story loosely draws from. Sales of classical texts covering the period saw a noticeable bump following the film's release, and it became a common reference point in classroom discussions about the difference between historical fact and stylized myth-making. Historians were quick to point out just how far the film strayed from historical accuracy, but even the harshest critics tended to acknowledge that it succeeded in getting people, especially younger audiences, curious enough to go looking for the real story behind the legend. For Gerard Butler personally, 300 didn't just boost his profile, it fundamentally redefined his career trajectory. Before stepping into Leonidas' sandals, Butler was a working actor with a handful of notable credits, including his lead role in The Phantom of the Opera a few years earlier, but he hadn't yet had that one defining, career-altering moment. 300 changed that almost overnight. Following its release, he became one of the more in-demand leading men in Hollywood, someone studios trusted to carry both action-heavy blockbusters and more character-driven dramas. He pivoted into romantic dramas like P.S. I Love You, took on darker, morally complex roles in projects like Law-Abiding Citizen, and later became closely associated with the action genre through his long-running role as Secret Service agent Mike Banning across multiple films. Even decades later, though, ask most casual fans to name a Gerard Butler role, and there's a very good chance the answer is still Leonidas. It remains the performance most closely tied to his public identity, a role that, according to his own account, cost him more physically and mentally than almost anything else he's done since. So when you rewatch 300 now, knowing everything that actually went into making it, it's hard not to see it a little differently. Those slow-motion battle sequences that once felt like pure stylistic flourish now carry a different weight, knowing that real injuries were happening just off camera between takes. The sculpted physiques that launched 1,000 gym memberships represented months of genuinely dangerous physical strain, not just discipline and hard work in the conventional sense. And that legendary on-screen brotherhood among the Spartans wasn't purely the product of good writing and solid chemistry reads during casting. It was forged through shared suffering in a hot, cramped studio, month after month, long before the cameras ever captured a single frame of the finished film. Gerard Butler has never framed any of this as complaining, to be clear. If anything, he's talked about the experience with a strange mix of pride and disbelief, acknowledging just how far he and the rest of the cast pushed themselves without necessarily recommending anyone else attempt to replicate it. It stands as one of those rare behind-the-scenes stories where the reality genuinely does live up to the intensity of what ended up on screen, which is exactly why it still gets brought up in interviews all these years later. Fans who grew up quoting the film's dialogue at parties or attempting the 300 workout at their local gym often had no idea just how close to the edge the people making that movie actually pushed themselves. At the end of the day, 300 endures not just because of its visual style or its endlessly quotable lines, but because of the very real human cost that went into creating it. It's a reminder that some of the most iconic moments in film history come from performers willing to put their bodies, and sometimes their long-term health, on the line for a role. Gerard Butler has been remarkably candid about that price in the years since, offering fans a much fuller picture of what it actually took to bring King Leonidas to life. And once you know that story, it's genuinely hard to watch this movie the same way again. So now that you know the real story behind one of the most physically demanding productions in modern Hollywood history, what do you think? Does knowing what the cast went through change how you see the film? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let us know which part of this story surprised you the most. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stories from your favorite films.